Hey friends, tonight we find ourselves not at a battlefield or in the throne room of some moody ancient king, but at a humble clay tablet, damp with fresh impressions and faint with the scent of wet earth and old arguments. You're sitting in the shadow of the Hittite capital, Hattusa, surrounded by messengers, scribes, and the faint scratch of styluses pressing polite outrage into mud. Yes, tonight we journey into the art of ancient diplomacy, where kings composed letters so absurdly formal and delicately passive aggressive that you'd swear they were inventing email before electricity. Now don't panic. You probably wouldn't survive a single Hittite court ceremony. These folks had rules for how many times to bow per letter, and even the clay had to be the right clay. You, with your coffee-stained keyboard and chaotic group chats, you'd be sacrificed to the sun god before lunch. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now turn off the lights, let your fan hum softly in the background, and let's begin tonight's journey. You're walking slowly through Hattusa. The city is wide, layered, and quiet in the morning. Stone walls rise around you, some cracked, some leaning, all carved with lions, gods, and warnings. The air smells like dust and rosemary, and somewhere nearby, bread is baking in a communal oven. You pass temples, stables, storerooms piled high with sacks of barley and figs. But your feet take you to the most overlooked building in any ancient capital, the archives. It's cooler inside. Shelves made of stone, hold rows of clay tablets, most of them packed tightly in reed boxes or stored in neat ceramic jars. The scribes are already working, some hunched over fresh tablets, others using small tools to edit a message that wasn't grovelly enough. You lean in close. On one table sits a letter from the king of Mitanni. It begins, "To my brother, the great king of Hatti, thus says your brother, may the sun god bless you, may your house shine, may your bread never run stale." And that's just the salutation. Here's your first official fact of the night. Hittite diplomacy relied heavily on ritual politeness. These weren't just letters, they were political weapons, crafted to flatter, manipulate, or remind other kings of their place in the cosmic pecking order. And it wasn't just what you said, it was how many lines you used to say it. A shorter greeting could mean offense, too long, and you looked desperate. Referring to someone as brother implied equal status, a very delicate game in a world where every other king thought he was the absolute chosen of the gods. You sit beside a young scribe. He's just finished a letter to Egypt, a tricky one, since the pharaoh's last message ended with, "Tell your king to remember who buried his grandfather." Ouch. The Hittite king is replying with a carefully veiled line, "I send you a fine robe. May its colors soothe any confusion your heart holds." Which is ancient clay tablets speak for. We're pretending you didn't say that. The scribe finishes the letter and sprinkles sand over the wet lines to help them dry. He then picks up a stamp, a royal seal, and presses it gently into the corner. The seal matters. Without it, the tablet is just words. With it, it's power. Now your weird historical detail for this section. Some letters were buried with kings, so their diplomatic arguments could continue into the afterlife. One Hittite tablet was found in a royal tomb with the final message: "Do not anger me in death as you did in life." Honestly, that's a level of grudge holding you have to respect. You step outside for a moment. The air is warm now, and a caravan arrives through the eastern gate, donkeys bearing baskets of copper, lapis lazuli, and oddly enough, perfume. The merchants dismount and bow. One carries a letter from Babylon, another from Ugarit. Each is handed to the scribes. Each is inspected for cracks, stamps, and most critically, tone. One scribe reads a Babylonian message aloud. It ends with, "Let us feast again soon, if your kitchens are finally up to the task." You hear a few murmured gasps. Someone writes, "Draft a response suggesting we send Hittite recipes next time." Burn. Here's your first scholarly argument of the night. Were these letters sincere diplomacy or elaborate performances of status? Some historians say the kings were genuinely trying to maintain peace. Others believe it was all pageantry, a slow-motion flex conducted in syllables and clay. And others argue the entire tradition was as much for their descendants as for each other. Whatever the truth, the result is the same. Hundreds of tablets survive, each one more polite and quietly cutting than the last. You find a bench beneath a fig tree outside the archives. The sun is warm on your face. The scent of papyrus and clay lingers in your nose. You watch as a scribe delivers a fresh letter to the palace. 2 guards read it aloud, twice, then nod and bow. It will be stored, copied, and maybe even sent to the temple to be blessed. A clay tablet, carried across mountains and rivers, might shape an alliance or start a war, but only if its opening line is perfectly worded. You smile, because in a world of empires and gods, nothing was more dangerous than a badly written "Dear King." You walk slowly along the outer wall of Hattusa. The sun is now high above, and the white stone glows like bone. A breeze stirs the long grass just beyond the city's edge, where shepherds guide sleepy sheep with half-hearted whistles and the lazy clang of bronze bells. But you're heading toward a much less pastoral corner of the city, the Royal Correspondence Chamber. Don't worry, no drama. This isn't where betrayals happen. This is where they're written politely. Inside, a long room hums with quiet urgency. Tables are packed with tablets, some fresh, some cracked, some broken, and glued back together so many times they look like jigsaw puzzles. Scribes move around like dancers in slow motion, dipping styluses into water, whispering phrases aloud to hear how they sound before committing them to clay. At the far end of the chamber, one scribe is stuck. His brows are knitted. He's muttering a phrase under his breath. "To my brother, the great king, may your cattle multiply like the stars of heaven." He pauses, frowns, then adds, "And may your goats not fall into ravines, even the small ones." Someone nearby snorts. He erases the line. Even in the Bronze Age, there's such a thing as too much sincerity. Here's your next historical truth. The Hittites were part of what historians call the Club of Great Kings. This wasn't a formal organization, no t-shirts, and no group chat. but it was understood there were only a handful of rulers who were equal in status: the kings of Hatti, Egypt, Babylon, Mitanni, and Assyria. They traded gifts, daughters, and heavily ceremonial letters. And this club had rules. You had to refer to each other as brother. You had to send appropriate gifts, preferably gold, never fake gold. Yes, that was a thing. And of course, you had to respond to letters within a reasonable amount of time. You pass a stack of tablets marked pending response. One is from Egypt. The scribe beside it sighs and says, "It's been 3 moons. Maybe they lost the messenger." Then adds under his breath, "Or maybe their scribes are just dramatic." You find a seat near a window. Outside, the hills stretch endlessly, olive trees dotting the horizon. Inside, someone is composing a letter to the king of Alashia, an island kingdom, possibly Cyprus. The letter begins, "Your copper is fine. Your last shipment arrived without rats. I am pleased." That's high praise, apparently. You try not to laugh, but the scribe catches your expression and shrugs. At least it wasn't moldy this time. Now for your weird but real historical tidbit. Some letters were bilingual, one side in Hittite, the other in Akkadian, the international language of diplomacy at the time. Think of it like ancient subtitles, except if you mistranslated even a word, it could insult an entire kingdom. There's even a preserved letter where the Akkadian version says, "my brother," while the Hittite version says, "my subordinate." Let's just say that message was not well received. You wander into a quieter part of the archive, the copies room. Every letter sent had to be copied and stored, not for legal reasons, but for political survival. If someone ever claimed, "But your king said this," the Hittites could pull out a backup and say, "Actually, no, here's what we said, and we've got 5 tablets that prove it." You watch as a young apprentice carefully etches into a damp tablet. The king of Babylon has sent 5 garments, 4 cups, and 1 extremely disappointing donkey. He glances up. "I think it's a metaphor," he says. You nod. Or maybe the donkey was just bad. The afternoon sun begins to lean westward. You follow a path out of the palace and down a wide stairway into a lower courtyard. Here, under canvas awnings, messengers sit drinking watered wine and brushing dust from their sandals. They've crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers, all to carry tiny tablets of polite bickering. You sit beside one of them. He shows you his pouch. Inside, 3 tablets, 1 from Egypt, 2 to Ugarit. You ask what they say. He shrugs. Mostly, "Hope your gods are happy, but please send better horses next time." Now for your academic tangle of the evening. Were these letters a form of diplomacy or a kind of passive war? Some historians say they were the backbone of peace. Others argue they were subtle weapons, ways of jabbing at enemies under the guise of civility. Some even suggest that the most flowery letters often hid the worst intentions. And of course, there's a third camp that believes most kings didn't read them at all, leaving the real diplomacy to scribes who were basically Bronze Age PR professionals. You sit with that. You look at your own inbox in your imagination, maybe not so different. The sun is low now. Back at the archives, The tablets are being sealed in clay envelopes. Yes, actual envelopes of clay. Sealed, stamped, and dried. Some are packed for travel in boxes lined with straw and beeswax. Others are shelved, never to be opened again. You run your hand along one of the shelves. The tablets are cool to the touch, solid, heavy. Each one holds a tone of voice that hasn't been heard in thousands of years. But it's still there. If you press your fingers gently, you can almost hear it. To my brother, the great king, may your house be full, your fields wet, and your enemies just slightly clumsy. The evening breeze wraps around you like a shawl as you step onto the roof terrace above the Hittite archive. The clay tiles are warm beneath your feet, still holding the heat of the day, and the stars are beginning to blink awake in the east. Below, you can see the lanterns flickering in the royal compound, and somewhere in the distance, a flute plays a soft, slow melody that echoes off stone. You sit on the edge of the terrace wall, and in your lap, a baked clay tablet. It's heavier than it looks. The cuneiform markings shimmer under the torchlight, like a puzzle begging for patience. This particular tablet is famous in the archive, the Zeta letter, they call it, sent from a Hittite king to a pharaoh of Egypt. It reads like a diplomatic handshake, but with very finely filed nails. It opens. To my brother, the great king of Egypt, may your health be as abundant as your wine, and may your scribes learn to spell my name properly this time. You chuckle, polite but pointed. Sus, here comes your next real historical truth. One of the most famous diplomatic texts from this period is the Treaty of Kadesh, signed between Pharaoh Ramses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III. It's often described as the first surviving peace treaty in history, written in duplicate, one copy in Egyptian hieroglyphs, the other in Hittite cuneiform. Both agree on peace and mutual support, but the Egyptian version paints Ramses as the clear victor, while the Hittite version suggests it was a friendly compromise. Sound familiar? Diplomacy hasn't changed that much. You leave the terrace and walk down a narrow corridor lit by oil lamps. The air smells of ink, clay, and saffron. You stop at a side room used only for translation. There, a scribe is working late. His fingers are stained with ochre. He's squinting at a letter from Ugarit, trying to decide if a certain word means trade agreement or mild insult involving camels. He mutters, "It's always camels." You offer no help. You just watch the clay dry. In the next room, another scribe is reviewing formulas. No, not math formulas. These are stock phrases used in Hittite diplomacy, chosen carefully for tone and position. Some examples: the sun shines upon your roof and upon your sandals. May your enemies remain confused and geographically distant. I return your messenger, unharmed and somewhat cleaner. Some letters were almost entirely composed of these formulaic flourishes. Others added subtle variations, tweaks, meant to suggest superiority. You walk past a shelf marked rejected drafts. It's taller than you. Now, your weirdest historical side note of the night. At least one Hittite king is believed to have written to multiple foreign rulers using the exact same letter, changing only the name and title. And once, he he accidentally sent two king's copies with the same name left in. Oops. Imagine being the king of Babylon and opening a letter that begins, "To the great king of Assyria." Someone definitely got demoted over that one. You exit the archives and walk toward the lower city. The streets are calm. Most people are asleep. Only the night guards, cats, and insomniac priests still stir. You pass by a merchant's house. Inside, he's reading aloud. Yes, reading, from a copy of a royal letter. He's not part of the court. He's just interested. Because in Hittite culture, these letters weren't just for kings. Copies were often read aloud in ceremonies, or even published, like public records or ancient press releases. You listen from the shadows as the man recites, "And should your horses arrive lame again, I shall assume your stables are cursed and your gods are inattentive." The line is followed by a chuckle, then the clink of a cup being raised. You tiptoe away, smiling. Now comes your final scholarly tangle for this act. Did Hittite diplomacy preserve peace or just delay war? Some say the letters represent a golden age of international cooperation, an early version of the UN, if the UN was carved into clay and involved a lot more camels. Others argue it was all performative, that these kings still warred constantly, and the letters were just a way to stall, bluff, and posture until the swords came out. But you think maybe, just maybe, they believed in the words, or at least in the ritual of writing them. Sometimes saying brother enough times does keep the peace, even if your brother keeps sending you chipped cups and claiming they're antique. You sit again beneath the fig tree in the courtyard. The stars above are the same ones the Hittites saw, the same ones they addressed in letters. May the gods of the heavens and the mountains bear witness. You lie back in the grass, tablet still warm in your hands, and as your eyes begin to close, you hear it, not aloud, but in your memory. "To my brother, the great king, may your sleep be deep, your dreams untroubled, and your scribes finally learn to spell." Morning returns to Hattusa in the softest of ways, slow beams of sunlight seeping through sandstone alleys, the rhythmic sweep of brooms against stone, and the groggy groan of a potter who stayed up too late drinking fig wine and arguing about the latest shipment from Ugarit. You wake to birdsong, the kind that sounds too cheerful for a world that still writes its treaties on mud. But your path today isn't in the palace archives. It's taking you beyond the walls. Because if you really want to understand the strangely sweet language of Hittite diplomacy, you'll need to visit the people behind the messages, the ones who carved the characters, yes, but also those who carried them across empires. You head south, following a narrow road that hugs a ridge above a dry riverbed. The wind is cool and smells faintly of thyme. A lizard darts past your foot. Somewhere behind you, someone sneezes with royal elegance. After about an hour's walk, you reach a modest way station, a small outpost where messengers rest, horses are traded, and couriers argue about how many times you're supposed to bow when handing someone a tablet from Babylon. There's a stable, a water trough, a tiny shrine with a weather-worn carving of the storm god holding a lightning bolt, like he's about to settle a dispute over international grain tariffs. Inside the outpost is where the real action happens. You step into the central hall, ducking slightly beneath a low lintel. Immediately, you're surrounded by motion, scribes scratching travel summaries onto clay shards, messengers comparing routes, and one elderly courier trying to explain, again, that the Mitanni king's wife is not technically a sister, but must be referred to as such, or else everything goes badly. A boy offers you honeyed barley cakes and a seat on a reed mat. You accept. Even diplomacy tastes better with snacks. Across from you, a woman is checking seals on a small wooden crate of tablets. She opens one and reads aloud, "May the day you read this be as bright as the mountain snow and as calm as your most well-behaved donkey." She rolls her eyes. Somewhere, a poet thinks he's clever. Your first key fact of this act: diplomatic couriers were highly trained, trusted, and occasionally feared. They weren't just mail carriers. They were eyes, ears, and sometimes voices of kings. A courier could deliver news of peace, war, marriage, or insult, all wrapped in the same little slab of clay. And if you killed a courier, that was grounds for a full-blown war. You follow one courier out to the stable. His name is Arlanta, and his horse has a name too, Second Favorite. Apparently, First Favorite retired with honors after outrunning a sandstorm. Arlanta lets you hold a sealed tablet. It's smooth, cool, marked with a line of string pressed into the edge, an indicator that it's urgent. You ask what's inside. He shrugs. Could be a marriage proposal, could be a threat, could be both. You laugh. He doesn't. You head back inside as a new courier arrives, dust-covered, sunburned, smiling like someone who just delivered 5 peace treaties and one sarcastic insult in 3 different kingdoms. She unwraps a pouch and reveals a tablet from Egypt. The Hittite overseer takes it delicately and says, "Let's see what the Pharaoh wants this time." He reads aloud, "To my brother, the king of Hatti, I send golden bracelets of the gods and a prayer for your mother's health. Also, please do not send any more singers. The last one frightened my crocodiles." Everyone in the room nods solemnly. Apparently this has happened before. Here's your bizarre but true detail. Music diplomacy was a thing. Hittite kings sometimes sent musicians as gifts or warnings, depending on how badly they played. There are letters that include requests like "send another harpist," "the last one sweated too much," or "your flutist was excellent, but why does he smell like olives?" Let's just say ancient HR departments would have had their hands full. Later that afternoon, you walk along a dusty trail beside 2 couriers debating the tone of a letter from Assyria. "Too formal," says one. "He's hiding something." "Too short," says the other. "It's an insult." You ask what the letter actually said. They reply in perfect unison. "The horses are healthy. The figs were underripe. May your gods not be offended." You all walk in silence for a while, trying to decode the passive aggression of underwhelming fruit. Now for your historical debate spotlight. Was Hittite diplomacy shaped by realpolitik or by shared religious values? Some scholars argue that these elaborate greetings and constant invocations of the sun god were just diplomatic fluff, decoration to cover a cutthroat world of resource grabs and power shifts. Others believe that invoking shared gods was the diplomacy, that recognizing the divine order was a way to frame peace, respect, and mutual survival. And then there's a rogue theory that Hittites were just really, really polite and got sick of being murdered by less polite neighbors. You glance down at a tablet tucked under your arm. It begins, "To my brother, may your dreams be vivid, but your ambitions well rested." Yeah, sounds about right. As the sun dips low, you return to the outpost. Dinner is lentils and boiled onions. The mood is light but tired. One courier tries to reenact a royal banquet using only a spoon, a towel, and 3 different voices. It goes about as well as you'd expect. After the meal, someone sings a lullaby in Hittite. It's slow, filled with rising and falling notes, and a strange line about wheat listening to the stars. You lie down near the shrine. The wind picks up slightly. Someone's donkey snorts in its sleep, and the last thing you hear before drifting off is a young courier whispering, "May your enemies miss their mark, and your bread stay warm longer than your patience." Dawn arrives in gold and lavender, spilling across the rooftops of the Hittite courier outpost like warm water across ancient stone. You stretch, brush crumbs of sleep from your cloak, and follow the scent of something doughy frying in goat fat toward the communal oven. There, you meet an apprentice scribe who's memorizing stock phrases between bites of flatbread. He greets you not with good morning, but with "May your household be orderly, and your sandals find no pebbles today." A little overkill for breakfast, but sure, he offers you a piece of bread and a phrase in return. "I will trade you a blessing for a bite." You nod, chew, and quietly marvel that in the Hittite world, even brunch was diplomatically negotiated. You set out again, this time heading east. The trail leads you into low hills dusted with dry shrubs and groves of twisted pistachio trees. Somewhere ahead lies a remote Hittite border post, a tiny outpost with a surprisingly large role, because this is where many foreign letters entered the empire to be screened, translated, or, if deemed too spicy, misplaced in a storm drain. The hike takes hours, but the air is dry and clean, and the landscape is gentle, like the land itself is whispering the same ancient phrases. "To my brother, may your oxen never grow weary. Please return my messengers, uninjured this time." By midday, you arrive at the border post. It's a squat stone building, surrounded by thorn bushes and a truly heroic number of goats. The captain of the post greets you with a raised eyebrow and the kind of tone that says, "I've read 17 letters today, and all of them use the word auspicious." He shows you inside. In a dark room cooled by thick stone walls, 2 scribes sit cross-legged, each working over an imported tablet. One is reading a message from Babylon, muttering, "Is this a threat, or are they just trying to send figs?" The other is struggling with something from Ugarit, which seems to have been written entirely in rhyme. He sighs, "We should charge extra for poetry." Here's your next key fact. Every tablet arriving from abroad had to be translated, interpreted, and sometimes reframed. That meant understanding context, tone, and what wasn't said just as much as what was. In a world where calling someone brother meant equality and calling them friend meant subordinate, every word was a diplomatic landmine. Some tablets even included footnotes. Yes, footnotes, written in miniature cuneiform like clarification. The phrase "your wheat is admirable" is not sarcastic in this context. Later that afternoon, you sit with the captain under a sun-bleached awning. He offers you water and a story. Once he says, a courier from Egypt arrived with two identical letters, one for the king of Hatti, one for the queen. Only the queen's letter was longer. War almost broke out. A marriage proposal was rescinded. 3 camels got blamed. Eventually, peace was restored with an apology tablet that included a recipe for honey cakes and the line, "My scribes have grown old and confused. Please forgive the length of my admiration." You laugh. The captain doesn't. "That's how 3 empires stayed friends," he says, by pretending every insult was a compliment spoken too quickly. Now for your weird historical tidbit. Some letters were scented. That's right. Clay tablets sometimes came wrapped in fragrant cloths, especially those meant for royal households. Imagine receiving an international message that smelled faintly of rosewater or frankincense. It's diplomacy with a hint of bathhouse. The practice was particularly common in correspondence involving queens or royal daughters, because in the Hittite world, marriage was diplomacy, and your fragrance might say as much as your dowry. You ask the captain if you can see the archive. He hesitates, then nods. In a locked room near the back, shelves of tablets sit under linen cloths. These are the messages too strange, too precious, or too politically awkward to destroy. You pick up one. It's a complaint from a vassal king, claiming his neighbor insulted him by sending a dishonest cow. You read the line aloud. Her udders do not match her reputation. It's hard to say if it's metaphor or livestock review. You decide it's both. Now for your academic knot of this act. Did the Hittites value sincerity or just the performance of it? Some researchers believe all this flowery language was just tradition, a long-winded mask over power politics. But others argue that the ritual of respect itself was the point, that even when 2 kings hated each other, the act of exchanging blessings, however exaggerated, kept things stable. After all, you can't fight someone you're still saying, "May your camels be fragrant too," probably. As the sun begins to set, you climb a small ridge behind the border post. From here, the valley stretches out like a painted scroll, olive trees, stone paths, distant villages glowing like amber beads. You sit on a boulder. A shepherd waves from the hill opposite. You wave back, and in your mind, you whisper, "To my brother, the great king of the hillside, may your sheep be decisive and your dog slightly less impulsive." When you return to the post, a new courier has arrived from the east. She's dusty, tired, and grinning. "I have a tablet from Mitanni," she says. "It's heavy. I think it's either full of blessings or insults written slowly." She unwraps it and hands it to the captain. He reads the opening. May your sons be obedient, your sandals soft, and your mother-in-law easily impressed. Then he smiles. Ah, he says, finally a good one. You wake the next morning to the rhythmic jingle of pack animals, the low murmur of traders exchanging coins and complaints, and the sharp bark of a dog trying to assert dominance over a donkey twice its size. The border post has become a bustling crossroads. Caravans from the east, messengers from the west, even a lone musician with a reed flute and a suspiciously vague reason for being there. He says he's been summoned for the spiritual health of Hadi's goats. You don't ask. You follow the scent of boiling chickpeas and mint into the main hall. A courier is arguing with a scribe about whether a letter from Babylon is using sarcasm or sacred metaphor. It begins, "May your shadow be long and your shade be brief." The room is split. One side thinks it's a blessing for leadership. The other thinks it means you cast a large shadow and don't offer much. Either way, the scribe sighs and copies it down without a verdict. Some arguments, he says, are best left to future archaeologists. Here's your first official fact of this section. The Hittites maintained massive archives, not just in Hattusa, but in regional centers like Sapinua and Topeka. These weren't just storehouses. They were curated, categorized, and cross-referenced with obsessive care. Topics included treaties, omens, international letters, grain records, even dream reports. One tablet, for example, recorded a dream in which a goat advised the king to reduce barley taxes. The king complied, possibly out of wisdom, possibly out of fear the goat would return. You travel west now, following an old road used by diplomatic missions. The stones under your feet are worn smooth by centuries of cautious footsteps, careful negotiations, and the occasional royal sulk. You pass a stone marker carved with cuneiform and topped by a horned lion. The inscription reads, "May the words carried upon this road never rot in the mouth nor fester in the ears." A long-winded way of saying, don't lie, but it sounds better in Hittite. After several hours of travel, you arrive at a royal guest house, a place where foreign envoys were hosted before being allowed into Hattusa proper. The building is large, cool, and faintly perfumed. A steward greets you with the line, "May your journey be forgotten by your feet, but remembered by your hosts." It's the ancient equivalent of, "Can I take your sandals and your trauma?" You're led into a wide hall where past envoys left offerings, gifts to the gods, to the Hittite king, and to the very concept of not being declared a threat. One shelf holds exotic jars of honey, another, bronze tools shaped like birds. But most curious is the wall of greeting tablets, each one a diplomatic opener. To the esteemed throne that shines brighter than morning salt. May the queen's health be silkier than spring lambs. Let our meeting be less awkward than the last. You run your hand along the tablets. They feel like fingerprints pressed into time, and some of them are funny on purpose. Here's your odd but true moment. Some Hittite letters used humor, often dry, passive-aggressive, or shockingly direct. One preserved message from a vassal king reads, You said you'd send copper. I waited. I sent men. You sent more words. My donkeys are now fluent, but still hungry. The letter concludes with, May this message arrive faster than your goods. Ouch. You head into the garden courtyard behind the guest house. It's quiet, fragrant with crushed thyme and lavender, and occupied by a single scribe sketching floral designs into the margin of a letter. You ask what he's working on. He tells you an apology tablet. Apparently, a shipment of oil jars arrived broken, and the Hittite king wants to stay in good standing with a sensitive Mitanni noble. The letter begins, The jars broke not from negligence, but from an excess of haste born from our joy in serving you. That's some next level damage control. The scribe winks. Sometimes clay diplomacy is half clay, half poetry. Now for your academic dilemma of the evening. Did the stylized tone of these letters help diplomacy or make it harder? Some argue the formalities smoothed over real grievances, giving rulers a way to complain without conflict. Others say it created distance, so much ceremony that true honesty became impossible. Imagine trying to express fear or anger wrapped in 1,000 syllables of praise. And then there's the theory that the tone wasn't for the recipient at all, but for posterity, that each message was written knowing it might someday be read by gods or you. As dusk approaches, the guest house hosts a quiet dinner for traveling envoys. You're invited to sit in on the conversation. A man from Ugarit discusses cloud shapes with a priest from Arzawa. A Babylonian trader pretends not to understand a Hittite joke and then tells a worse one in return. Somewhere, a cat hops onto a table and steals a fig. The steward stands and reads a sample diplomatic greeting from memory. To the ones who walk long roads and write short letters, may your arrival be gentle and your tea strong. You raise a cup. So do they. And for a moment, diplomacy feels less like performance and more like the world's oldest dinner party. It's well past midnight now, and the guest house has fallen into a hush. Oil lamps flicker low. A few envoys have fallen asleep at the tables, their heads resting on their arms beside empty plates and cooling tea. You tiptoe past them, guided only by moonlight and the distant hoot of an owl that sounds like it might also be evaluating diplomatic phrasing. You wander into the back room of the house, a chamber used not for writing, but for decoding. This is where coded messages were unpacked. Yes, coded. Because not all clay diplomacy was sincere. Sometimes the real message was hidden within the obvious one. A scribe leans over a low table, studying a seemingly ordinary letter. On the surface, it reads, We thank you for the fine wheat. Our people are well. The weather is lovely. But he taps the second line and mutters, Third sign, fifth word. See how it's misshaped. You lean in. What looks like a clumsy scribe's mistake is actually a marker, a signal. It turns out every third line contains an embedded phrase. Pieced together, the hidden message reads, Your ally plots with the West. Prepare the guards. Now here's your final, hard historical fact of Act 2. Hittites used cipher techniques in their correspondence, simple but effective. Sometimes it was hidden grammar. Sometimes it was layout, where the spacing of signs signaled new meanings. And sometimes it was just about who carried the message. A trusted courier might recite an entirely different message than what was written. It was diplomacy, with plausible deniability baked in. As you sit in the decoding room, one scribe looks up from his work and says, half joking, "You think kings trusted the letters? Number they trusted the men who brought them." You nod. It's the same now, isn't it? An email is only as trustworthy as the person behind the keyboard, and whether they remember to attach the file. You leave the room and step out into the inner courtyard. Above, the sky is packed with stars, blinking like slow sparks in a black sea. The air smells of cold stone and distant rosemary. You sit on the ledge of a fountain that hasn't worked in centuries, and in the silence you imagine a message. To the stars, the great watchers of the night, may your patience endure longer than our politics. You almost chuckle, because that might be the most honest diplomatic sentence of the entire empire. You awaken in a guest room above the archive, the kind of place where foreign dignitaries were once quartered with modest formality. Soft woven rugs, walls painted with faded storm god symbols, and a ceramic pitcher of water on the sill, still cool from the night air. You blink at the ceiling and wonder how many negotiations began right here, half asleep, half hoping the other guy had worse sandals than you. As sunlight spills across the floor, you realize you've spent days tracing messages across a vast and ancient empire. But today, you return to where it all ends, the tombs. Because no letter, no matter how polite or perfumed, escapes the final courier, time. The road east from Hattusa leads into a sun-bleached valley, quiet except for the distant whine of cicadas and the crunch of your footsteps on loose gravel. The landscape narrows into stone, crags, and ridges where tombs have been carved directly into the cliffside. The largest belongs to a king, his name long weathered into dust, though the inscription above the entrance still reads, "He who spoke peace with many mouths." It says, "I sent letters to kings, but none to death. It came anyway." Inside, the tomb is cool and dry. A corridor leads to a vaulted chamber where stone shelves once held offerings, tablets, and ritual items. Most are gone now, moved to museums, lost to history, but some faint carvings remain. You trace your fingers over a relief showing two kings shaking hands beneath a sunburst. One wears the tall cap of Hatti, the other the stylized beard of Babylon. Above their heads, a cuneiform line. To speak is to build, to listen is to live. You sit on the stone bench and exhale. This was a world where words built walls and bridges, and sometimes both at once. Here's your first grounded fact of Act 3. Some royal tombs in the Hittite Empire included clay tablets as grave goods, either written by the king for the king or about the king's dealings in life. These weren't mere records, they were proof that he had honored gods, respected allies, or at least pretended well enough. Letters as legacy. You leave the tomb and walk along a path behind the ridge, where wildflowers grow in clusters between stones. Here, the graves are smaller: scribes, messengers, archivists, people who spent their lives pressing meaning into mud. A tablet rests beside one such grave. You brush off the dust. It reads, "He wrote the treaty with no mistakes. His back hurt. His words did not." You grin. Some legacies are quiet, but permanent. Later, you reach a ruined archive, a smaller site, perhaps once a royal satellite, crumbled walls, a few broken jars, and a slab half buried in the earth. You kneel to inspect it. The text is nearly erased, but you make out the opening lines. If this reaches you, know that I am grateful. If it does not, know that I tried. That's it. No elaborate greeting, no divine invocations, no flattery or bartering. Just that, and somehow it feels more intimate than all the polished prose you've read so far. You sit beside it for a while, letting it settle, like the silence after a varied extinctions. Now comes your strangest historical detail of this act. Some Hittite letters, especially personal ones, were written knowing they might never be delivered. These weren't practice runs. They were more like emotional artifacts, confessions, apologies, blessings. Found later in tombs, sealed jars, even beneath doorsteps. Because sometimes diplomacy wasn't for the living. Sometimes it was for the gods or the writer themselves. You make your way back toward Hattusa under a sky slowly bruising with twilight. And as you return, a new ceremony begins, the reading of old peace treaties aloud for the new season. It happens once a year in the courtyard under hanging lanterns. Scribes gather, citizens listen. The words echo softly against the walls. If your sons betray you, mine will not. If my fields fail, yours shall share. If our gods disagree, may they do so gently. No one moves much. Some people close their eyes. A few nod along, like hearing an old song sung well. Your final academic curiosity of the evening. Did Hittite diplomacy endure because of its structure or its spirit? Some claim it was all ritual and repetition, a system so rigid it couldn't break. But others believe it was flexible because of its rituals, that by repeating these forms again and again, people remembered the weight of words and the power of pretending peace long enough to make it real. You're not sure who's right, but you know this. In the middle of an empire built on stone and thunder, someone still thought the best way to settle things was to sit down and write it out. As the last line of the treaty is read, the crowd quietly disperses. You stay seated. A young apprentice hands you a scrap of clay, still soft. He smiles and says, "Your turn." You pause, then begin writing. To the listener of this quiet tale, may your rest be deeper than politics, your dreams free of negotiations, and your tomorrow gentler than today. You place it near the others and watch it dry under the stars. The wind picks up the next morning as you leave the heart of Hattusa behind. It carries a faint scent of burnt olive wood, warm dust, and something older, like parchment left out too long in the sun. You walk with purpose now, through winding alleys where the stone walls lean in as if eager to eavesdrop on whatever message you carry. Because today, your path leads to the place where messages were born, the Scribes' Academy. It's tucked against the eastern slope of the city, behind a row of tamarisk trees and flanked by carved lions who look extremely unimpressed by your posture. You bow just in case. Inside the courtyard, the atmosphere is more monastic than political. Scribes shuffle across smooth tiles with a kind of reverent exhaustion. Some chant grammar rules aloud. Others argue over verb tenses like they're settling a murder trial. You sit beside a young student, hunched over a practice tablet. He's carving the line, "May your ox be strong, and your scribe not too clever." He looks up and whispers, "It's for practice." No one really says that anymore. You smile and ask what he wants to write one day. He shrugs. Something that matters, something that isn't just copied from the last guy who copied it from the guy before him. You nod and say, "Then you better start paying attention. Here's your key truth for this section. The Hittites took scribal education extremely seriously. Grammar, formal openings, metaphors, these were codified, practiced, and even ranked by importance. Some scribes specialized in diplomacy, others in dreams, a few in insult mitigation, but all were trained to understand not just what to write, but how it would be read. It wasn't just language, it was psychology in clay. You're invited into the main hall by a senior instructor, a man with ink-stained fingers and a permanent squint from reading tablets too close to oil lamps. He guides you past rows of students, muttering formulaic lines like sacred prayers. "To the king, my brother, may your wheat thrive, even as your enemies stumble. I return your daughter with great joy and minor repairs." Okay, maybe not that last one, but the phrasing was flexible. Now for your bizarre but real detail. Some scribes practiced by writing mock letters, fake correspondences with fictional kings, full of sarcasm and jokes. These were never meant to be sent, but many were preserved in hidden caches. One tablet reads, "To the king of the place I just invented, may your mustache grow faster than your grain. I regret to inform you, your goat has defected to the Mitanni." The margin reads, "Exercise 14, tone, playful menace. You can't make this stuff up. Except, you could if you were a student scribe. You visit a chamber where real diplomatic letters are stored for training. You pick one at random and read, 'May your gods favor you with sleep undisturbed, feasts plentiful, and relatives who do not overstay.' You raise an eyebrow. The instructor grins. 'That's one of ours. I slipped it in after a trade dispute. Got us double the copper.' He leans closer. You'd be amazed what people will agree to when you bless their sleep. Outside, the sun climbs high. The instructor shows you a wall of common errors, engraved reminders of what not to do. Writing "my servant" instead of "your servant," accidental insult. Forgetting to mention gods equals implied heresy. Swapping the symbol for daughter and ox equals awkward dowry conversations. You chuckle. He doesn't. That one nearly cost us a border village. Now comes your final scholarly knot. Did scribes shape policy or just reflect it? Some scholars argue scribes were merely tools, copying what kings dictated. Others insist they wielded quiet influence, choosing words that softened threats, sweetened demands, or left room for peace. There's even a theory that one particularly poetic scribe prevented a war by describing a mountain so beautifully that both kings decided it was too pretty to fight over. You want that to be true? Maybe it is. You spend the afternoon walking the Academy's garden, a peaceful space meant for reflection, with benches carved from old lintels and flowers whose names have long since faded. A small plaque sits beneath a fig tree. It reads, "He wrote a letter. It arrived late. It was still welcome." That's the hope, isn't it? That words, carefully shaped and sincerely sent, still mean something, even if they take their time, even if they arrive when no one's looking. You leave the academy at dusk, a soft breeze stirring your cloak as the lamps of Hattusa begin to glow. And as you walk back down toward the market square, a young courier passes you, carrying a sealed tablet marked with the emblem of the queen. He nods at you, then turns a corner and vanishes. No fanfare, no trumpets, just one more message, moving quietly through a world built on belief that someone, somewhere, will read it carefully. Night returns gently over Hattusa, like a polite guest who doesn't want to interrupt. The wind shifts cooler now, brushing through the alleyways with the whisper of parchment being turned. You find yourself once again near the great archive, not to study, not to question, but simply to sit. You settle on the stone steps beneath a torch that crackles like lazy applause. There's no sound but the city's breath and the slow unfolding of memory, because you've seen where the messages begin, how they travel, and even how they're misread. But the question remains, what happens to the words that never arrive? You pull a folded scrap from your satchel, one of the many practice tablets gifted to you by the scribes. On it is an unfinished line. "If my words fail, may silence do better." It doesn't rhyme. It doesn't flatter. It simply waits. You turn it over and over, wondering if the Hittites, masters of polite flattery, ritual phrasing, and diplomatic chess, ever felt the weight of misunderstood silence. Here's your final concrete truth. Many Hittite letters remain untranslated. Some are damaged. Others are written in regional dialects, and a few include rare words found nowhere else. To this day, scholars debate whether a certain phrase means "we offer peace" or "we offer lentils." You can imagine how one of those goes over better at treaty time. Back inside the archive, a single flame burns in the copy room. A gray-haired scribe is working, slow, steady, copying a royal letter, not onto clay, but onto wax tablet, for reading aloud the next day. You ask him if he likes the letter. He shrugs. It's the same as always. Praise, praise, trade goods. Reminder not to send ugly horses. Then he pauses. But there's a line at the end I like. He reads, Let this letter be our distance, and may it shrink. He sets down his stylus. That's not in all the versions. Someone added it. You both stare at the tablet, letting the line sink in. You walk home slowly, past the edge of the citadel, past closed market stalls and shuttered windows. A child sleeps on a mat by the doorway, a clay toy tucked into their arm. Somewhere in the distance, a flute plays again, hesitant and off-key, like someone remembering a tune from years ago. You pass a shrine, a small one, just a carved niche in the wall with a handful of offerings, olives, grain, and a piece of clay wrapped in cloth. Curious, you unwrap it. There's no royal seal, no introduction, just a single phrase, "I am sorry." No one signed it. You put it back carefully, like returning something sacred to its altar. Here's your last strange detail. Among all the polished, formal, court-approved messages, archaeologists have found a handful of anonymous tablets. No king's name, no date, no destination, just raw emotion, grief, guilt, hope. These weren't diplomacy, these were confessions to clay. You imagine someone long ago sitting by a fire, pressing a truth into mud because they couldn't say it aloud, and then burying it because even unspoken words deserve a place to rest. As you near your quarters, the stars overhead shine like punctuation marks in a letter too long to read in one night. You sit on the threshold, looking up, and you think, maybe that was the Hittites' greatest accomplishment. Not the cities, not the wars, but the idea that words, even in fragile clay, could outlast the kings who spoke them. So you write one last message in your mind, addressed not to any king nor any ally, but to the future, to the reader centuries from now who finds this thought among ruins. May you also believe that silence is not empty, and that every letter, however small, carries a hope too stubborn to die. Now, you can set the clay down, let the tablets dry in the moonlight, let the messengers dismount, let the ancient sentences fold into silence. You've traveled far tonight, not by horse or cart, but by breath and thought. You've walked the halls of kings who spoke in whispers, not war cries. You've read letters pressed by calloused fingers, messages sent through desert winds, and diplomatic tension wrapped in perfumed cloth and cautious metaphors. And through it all, you were part of the quiet, the calm between nations, the slow, steady beat of a world that chose words over wounds. Now that world is fading. The torches are low. The scribes are asleep. The roads are empty, save for the rustle of fig leaves and the soft thud of sandal on stone. You are still. There's no message left to send tonight, no apology to phrase just right, no metaphor to decode, no king to flatter, only stillness and sleep. So let the peace of Hattusa settle across your shoulders like a heavy robe. Let the wind through the cedars translate into nothing more than a lullaby. Let the gods of diplomacy, whoever they are, offer you one final blessing, that your rest be long, your dreams kind, and your heart unburdened by unread letters. Hey friends, tonight we're heading somewhere refreshingly chilly. No firestorms of empire, no battlegrounds or collapsing dynasties. Tonight, we're going somewhere peacefully weird, somewhere that smells like moss, feels like lava rock, and sounds like wind tugging gently at wool cloaks. Tonight, we're going to medieval Iceland, not for dragons, not for volcanoes, although both are on standby as usual, but for something far more surprising, their ancient legal system. Yep, we're talking Viking law, the real stuff. And listen, I know medieval Viking law code doesn't scream bedtime, but I promise, by the time we finish, you'll be so soothed by fjords and fair trials that even your brain's most chaotic lawyer neuron will be yawning. But be warned, if you'd lived through some of these court cases, you'd probably have been fined for falling asleep at the wrong moment. Or worse, someone would have recited law poems at you for hours. You might not survive it. So before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. I bet we'll have at least 3 Midnight Icelanders tonight. Now turn off your lights, switch on your fan for that nice ambient whirring, and let's begin tonight's journey. You begin in the Thingvellir Valley, where the earth is literally pulling apart. The American and Eurasian tectonic plates split the land here, creating ridges, cracks, and quiet tremors beneath your boots. The air is clean, ridiculously clean. It smells like cold grass and wet basalt. You walk along a path trodden by generations of Icelanders, heading to one of the most unique and enduring experiments in law and governance in all of human history, the Althing. This wasn't just a court. It wasn't just a parliament. It was both, and also a yearly social festival, market, gossip session, matchmaking fair, and possibly a very scenic excuse to avoid your neighbors for a while. The Althing began in the year 930 CE, just a few decades after Iceland was settled by Norse immigrants, adventurers, and people with a very passionate dislike for Norwegian kings. The early Icelanders didn't build castles. They didn't have cities. They had farms, clans, and opinions. And to manage all that without total chaos, they created a system of laws that traveled by memory, not ink. You hear it before you see it, low voices echoing off the rock, the gentle clatter of hooves, the rustle of cloaks, and the occasional snore of someone who's been here since sunrise. You crest a ridge and look down on the Law Rock, a raised platform where Iceland's law speaker would recite from memory a third of the entire legal code each summer, 1/3 per year, 3-year rotation, all oral, no pressure. The law speaker stands at the edge of the rock, draped in gray wool, voice rolling out into the assembly like a glacier that's just discovered public speaking. He says, "If a man steals hay from his neighbor's stack in darkness, let him repay in kind, unless the stack was ungathered, in which case your mind wanders, which is fine. So did everyone else's. People brought picnic blankets to this thing." Here's your first historical fact of the night. The Althing is the oldest, still functioning national parliament in the world. It began as a general assembly of all free men in Iceland and still exists today, though these days it features fewer goats and more microphones. It was radically democratic for its time. While only certain men could vote or speak, the general gathering allowed a surprising level of public access and transparency, especially for the early Middle Ages. And unlike many of its European contemporaries, Iceland had no king. The people governed themselves through a web of laws, consensus, compensation, and a lot of reciting things out loud. You follow a narrow path to the Logretta, a semicircle of seated chieftains who serve as judges. They don't wear robes, they wear furs, and they're discussing a very serious case. A man borrowed a horse, promised to return it fattened, and instead returned it less horse-shaped than before. The owner is furious. The borrower insists the horse was cursed. One chieftain sighs, wipes his nose on his sleeve, and proposes a fine of 3 ounces of silver and a formal apology performed with harp accompaniment. Everyone agrees. The horse is still dead, but at least the rules are alive. You sit down on a mossy rock and take in the scene. Children chasing sheep between tents, vendors yelling about sealskin boots, a group of teenagers daring each other to touch the law rock after dark. Someone nearby recites a love poem about cheese. You realize that Althing wasn't just legal, it was cultural. It was how Iceland remembered itself. Now here's your quirky detail. If someone was found guilty of certain crimes, like minor theft or slander, they could be punished by public satire. Yes, in verse. If someone composed a poem so cutting, so clever, and so memorable that everyone repeated it, the poem became a kind of social sentence. Imagine getting roasted so badly your punishment spreads across generations. Modern legal systems could never. As the sun begins its slow Icelandic descent, which to be honest takes like 6 hours in summer, you pass a group of women debating a land inheritance. They argue calmly, then passionately, then someone throws a fish. It turns out women in medieval Iceland had more legal rights than in many other European societies. They could inherit land, request divorce, and sometimes even represent themselves in legal disputes. Some historians still debate how far those rights extended, but there are sagas filled with women arguing circles around their male neighbors and winning. The question remains, did the system empower them, or were these just exceptional stories in a still male-dominated culture? Scholars aren't sure, but the fish definitely landed with authority. As the night deepens and campfires begin to crackle, you lie on your back beneath a sky that never fully goes dark. Above you, the colors of the aurora. Around you, quiet murmurs of law, life, and a stubborn people who believed that governing yourself is just as important as being right. You awaken to the scent of driftwood smoke and dried fish, the kind of aroma that says, "Good morning, you're in medieval Iceland. Please adjust your breakfast expectations." You roll over in your wool blanket, half buried in heather and volcanic rock, and listen as the Althing begins to hum back to life. Across the valley, tents rattle in the breeze, Children chase goats with zero chance of catching them, and somewhere nearby, someone is already preparing to recite a lawsuit in rhyme. Because why not start the day with poetic litigation? You trudge toward the law rock again, where the law speaker is mid-sentence, and let it be known that any man who challenges the boundary stone without proper witnesses shall be fined 1 ounce of silver or 1 song of shame, to be performed barefoot in sheep dung. Here's your second grounded historical fact of the night. Icelandic law was compensatory, not punitive. That means, instead of jailing someone, you'd usually pay a fine or arrange a settlement. Murder? That's a weregild, literally man price. You don't rot in a dungeon. You negotiate how much your victim's family should receive. And if you can't pay, well, you're outlawed. Yes, that's a legal term here. Full outlawry meant you were stripped of all legal protections and could be killed by anyone. Not ideal, but also not necessarily a death sentence. Some managed to live out their days in the wilderness, fishing in silence and avoiding eye contact. So basically, early Icelandic introverts. You wander past a line of chieftains, whispering and pointing toward the Booth Hill, where tents are pitched by every clan and legal district. Each tent acts as a home base for Thingmen, the free farmers who pledge allegiance to a chieftain. They cast votes. They hear cases. They do a lot of standing around with arms crossed, looking extremely principled in the wind. You overhear one man mutter, "Next time I pick a chieftain, I'm asking how many cows he owns before how many poems he's memorized." Smart. Now, time for a strange but true detail. No wandering officers with truncheons and stern eyebrows. Law enforcement in Iceland was DIY. If someone owed you compensation and didn't pay, it was your job, or your family's, to enforce the ruling. That meant hiring muscle, sending letters, or just awkwardly showing up to someone's farm with a sheep and a sharp memory. Sometimes justice came in the form of a burned barn or a reappropriated fishing net. Messy? Sure, but also remarkably orderly. Most people followed rulings because honor mattered more than muscle. You arrive at a small stage where a man is dramatically accusing another of slander. And then he called me a seal-faced spoon before witnesses in the hot spring. Gasps, chuckles. A scribe in the corner mutters, "That's a new one." You watch as the judges consult, eventually ruling that the insult was technically provocative, but not actionable. However, the accused must offer a public toast of apology with compliments. He groans, then stands and declares, "To my worthy rival, whose eyebrows are majestic and whose sheep are, I assume, reasonably clean." It's a win. People clap. Now comes our open scholarly debate. Was the Icelandic legal system really fair or just flexible? Some historians argue it allowed power to stay in the hands of elite families who could afford to settle disputes. Others counter that the system actually kept tyranny in check, offering clear rules and recourse even for common farmers, something unheard of in many medieval societies. The truth? It's complicated. It worked surprisingly well until it didn't. But that's a tale for another act. As the sun hangs low and golden over the western cliffs, the Althing slowly transforms from court to marketplace. You stroll past merchants shouting about butter, wool, honey, and shark meat, which smells like it's been aging since the invention of weather. You spot a woman hand copying the latest saga into a vellum scroll. Nearby, two children are arguing about whether their father's axe is technically a weapon or a tool. Legal minds in training. You pause at a stall where an old man is selling carved wooden tokens, each one shaped like a sheep or a fish or a smug-looking puffin. These are for memory, he tells you. Memory? Aye, every deal you make, every favor, every promise, mark it with one of these. Then, when you forget why someone owes you a boat, you check the puffin. You buy one. It winks at you. You feel mildly judged. At twilight, a bard stands near the law rock, singing a saga about a man who refused to pay his hay debt and had to give up his beard as collateral. The crowd laughs, but the song ends on a quiet note. Better to bend like birch and live than break in pride and lose the land. People murmur in agreement. You walk back toward your camp slowly, watching as the valley darkens. Lanterns glow behind tent walls. The stars are out. Somewhere, someone is being gently scolded for getting drunk and quoting the laws backward. It's peaceful, oddly, democratic, and deeply human. This place, this system, so far removed from our world of apps and inboxes, feels familiar in its flaws, its creativity, and its stubborn hope that people given a voice can talk their way toward fairness, even if sometimes that talking involves goats. The night drapes itself gently over Thingvellir like a wool cloak, thick, quiet, and slightly itchy around the neck. You stretch your legs beside a low fire where someone's boiling a pot of fish stew that smells like regret, lightly seasoned with algae. But no one complains. In fact, a man leans in and says, "Better than being outlawed. At least this fish doesn't hunt you in the forest." You nod, politely unsure how to respond, because tonight's conversations aren't about who won which lawsuit. They're about who was clever, who lost face, and who got away with quoting the law backward while drunk and still somehow won the case. That happened once. It's a saga now. You wander away from the crowd, up toward the speaker's ridge, where moss creeps between ancient stones, and the stars are so bright they seem to rest right above your brow. Here, elders once stood to discuss hard cases, the ones with no good answers. If someone wronged you and paid the fine, but you still wanted revenge, what then? If two clans made peace, but an uncle refused to accept it, what then? If a storm washed away your farm and your neighbor took the sheep, claiming they floated into his land on God's tide, what then? That's where custom stepped in, and mediators, and the occasional old woman with an opinion sharp enough to slice driftwood. Here's your final historical truth of Act 1. Icelandic law was never truly fixed. It was flexible, adaptable, and constantly revised through oral debate and seasonal consensus. The law speaker was expected to remember changes, repeat them clearly, and answer questions on the fly. And once every few years, a major revision would be agreed upon and committed, not to parchment, but to the collective memory of a people who believed truth could be carried in voice. You feel that weight now, as the wind picks up across the rocks, and you realize this wasn't just governance, this was performance, and they were good at it. You pass a quiet tent with low chanting inside. You peek in and see a law apprentice, barely 16, reciting the rules of insult escalation, something between a chant and a lullaby. First, you warn. Second, you witness. Third, you strike, verbally, not physically. Fourth, you file. Fifth, you feast. You ask if feast is mandatory. She shrugs. Depends on the insult. That feels right. Now for your final weird but wonderful footnote of the night. There was a time when Icelanders held a vote over whether to convert to Christianity by literally shouting down a cliff. That's real. In the year 1000, the Althing debated religion so fiercely that it threatened to fracture the island. So they chose a respected pagan chieftain, Thorgir, to meditate overnight and decide. He returned, stood before the people, and declared, "We shall all have one law and one faith." Then, legend has it, he went home and threw his own pagan idols into a waterfall. Today, that waterfall is called Godafoss, the waterfall of the gods. But scholars still debate, did he truly believe or just save Iceland from civil war? No one knows. But the vote held, and Iceland remained one. You sit by the edge of that same cliff now, where a few tourists will someday take awkward selfies. The breeze is stronger here. You hear the echoes of ancient voices, not ghostly, not dramatic, just stubborn and very, very committed to reading the bylaws exactly as written. The fire back at camp burns low. Someone is softly playing a langspiel, a stringed instrument that sounds like a cross between a harp and a sigh. You lie down again and close your eyes. The Althing continues somewhere nearby. Quiet voices, still arguing about sheep, boundaries, honor, and the right words. And in that rhythm, in that quiet persistence, you understand this was a place where talk ruled swords, where memory outlasted parchment, and where law was less about punishment and more about belonging. Morning in Thingvellir is not so much a sunrise as it is a long, apologetic dimming of the stars. The sun doesn't so much rise as politely arrive, like a guest who doesn't want to interrupt your dreams, but would very much like to ask about that lawsuit involving sheep and an insult involving one's grandmother. You stretch beneath a sky that has just enough color to suggest breakfast. From nearby tents, you hear the murmur of voices preparing for another day of arguments, accusations, and salted fish. But something feels different today. Today, you've been asked to serve as a witness, not for a murder, thankfully. Those are reserved for chieftains and saga authors, but for a property dispute that's escalated to the point where someone has drawn a map in lamb's blood. You hope that was a stylistic choice. You follow the plaintiff an elderly farmer with one ear and two very large sons, toward the court circle, an area marked by stones and expectations. The defendant awaits, flanked by cousins and a goat that keeps trying to eat someone's tunic. Everyone takes their place. 3 judges settle onto their stones. The law speaker steps forward and begins the opening lines. On this day, let the voices be heard. May the words be measured, the memories true, and the wind be still, unless someone lies. A gust immediately follows. People glance around. One judge mutters, "Well, that's ominous." Let's start with our first major truth of Act 2. Legal cases at the Althing were performed in public, not behind closed doors, not in whispers, but in full view of the community, because transparency mattered more than titles. You couldn't sneak in a secret clause or buy a quiet ruling. Everyone heard what you said, and everyone remembered what you didn't. That pressure kept things mostly honest, or at least impressively creative. The plaintiff makes his claim, something about his neighbor's boundary stone being moved by exactly the length of one angry goose. The crowd chuckles. The defendant fires back. "I didn't move the stone. The frost did, and possibly his goat, or his guilt." Gasps. A child yells, "That's a saga line." Someone jots it down. The judges confer. One picks up a measuring stick carved with runes. Another pulls out a boundary scroll sealed with sheep wax. After 2 hours of murmuring, diagramming, and one interruption involving an enthusiastic bard, a verdict is reached. The stone must be moved back. The plaintiff receives half a barrel of dried fish as compensation, and the goat is to be supervised more closely. Everyone nods, satisfied. Justice has been served, and lightly salted. Now for your first quirky fact of Act 2. Icelanders had no buildings for court. None. The Althing met entirely in the open. Rain, wind, or sunstroke, it didn't matter. You argued your fate beside cliffs, on moss, in fog, and sometimes during volcanic tremors. One saga mentions a case that paused mid-verdict because someone claimed the gods were commenting with earthquakes. Can't argue with that. After your witness duties are over, you decide to explore a little. You pass through the market ridge, where traders are shouting about whalebone combs, goose-down pillows, and a new saga that includes 3 betrayals, 2 beheadings, and a very tasteful romance subplot. You buy a honey-cured pastry that's 70% oats, 30% bees, and 100% too chewy for dignity. Delicious. Nearby, a group of young apprentices argue over law poetry, which is a real thing. One says, "Rhyming makes it easier to memorize." Another says, "Rhyming makes it harder to take seriously." A third says, "You're both wrong. All laws should be shouted over drums." You quietly agree with all 3. Now comes our first scholarly debate of the act. Was the Althing truly democratic, or just theatrically so? Some historians believe the system, while innovative, still favored wealthy chieftains who could afford retainers, legal experts, and long speeches. Others argue that even small farmers had real access to the process, that the visibility of the law kept corruption low and fairness high. One thing is clear: the theater of law mattered. Whether you were rich or poor, everyone had to stand, speak, and answer. And if your speech was bad, well, the verdict might still be fair. But the poetry composed about you, absolutely brutal. As midday fog drifts in from the lake, you climb toward the law rock again. The law speaker has taken a break, replaced temporarily by a stand-in speaker who's younger, nervously sweating, and accidentally skipped 2 lines. He starts again, then again. The crowd murmurs, a dog barks, someone offers him dried kelp as motivation. Finally, he finds his rhythm. Let it be known, the laws of the land are not carved in stone, but held in breath, in bone, in tone. Applause. He survives. You return to your tent, passing a saga reader, reciting to a small crowd. The story? A love affair between a fisherman and a widow, interrupted by taxes, a moody volcano, and the surprise arrival of a bear with legal authority. It's unclear whether the bear is literal or metaphorical. No one asks. They just listen. Because stories, like laws, are meant to be shared, reshaped, and remembered. Night is not far now. The wind grows colder. Your thoughts grow slower. You sit beneath a lopsided birch and realize there is no building here, no throne, no jail, just voices and memory and the soft crunch of moss under 1,000 years of feet. And in that simplicity, something surprisingly fair has endured. You wake before the sun finishes its lazy climb, the sky still a dusky blue tinged with silver. A raven hops across the field nearby, dragging what appears to be someone's legal scroll. You briefly consider chasing it. Then remember, ravens were sacred to Odin, and technically, stealing from them could be interpreted as heresy. You decide the scroll probably wasn't that important. Instead, you wrap yourself in your blanket, grab a hunk of rye bread that could double as weaponry, and walk toward the dispute tents where the real drama happens. Today is about feuds, and unlike the goat poetry or boundary stones, feuds don't end in smiles. You arrive just in time to witness 2 families squaring off over an old grudge. A man accused another of sorcery. The accused retaliated by calling his neighbor a liar with the brain of a damp seal. Now they're arguing about honor, daughters, and whether a dream counts as legal evidence. Spoiler, sometimes it does. The law speaker listens silently. The judges pace. The crowd leans in, eating dried cod like popcorn. The plaintiff finishes by swearing an oath. He places his hand on a sacred ring and says, "If I lie, may the gods take my strength, my sight, and my stew." You feel like the stew part was improvised. Still, it's effective. Let's pause for your next historical anchor. Oath-taking in Iceland was legally binding and deadly serious. You couldn't just say, "I promise." You had to swear before gods, kin, and witnesses, often on sacred objects like Thor's ring or a family heirloom. If you lied under oath, you didn't just risk social shame. You could be outlawed, exiled, or worse, mocked in verse until your grandchildren moved to Greenland out of embarrassment. The judges issue a temporary truce. They'll reconvene in the morning after a cooling off period, which mainly involves eating together and not stabbing each other. You walk away from the tension and head toward a quieter part of the Althing, the storyteller's ridge. There, a woman is reciting a tale about a lawyer who won a case using only riddles. You sit, enraptured. Her voice lilts like the wind over stone. Her punchlines land with the precision of a thrown axe. And somewhere in the story is a lesson about listening before speaking, which you pretend to take very seriously while chewing the rest of your rye rock. Now, for a curious legal quirk. If a case couldn't be resolved, parties could agree to trial by ordeal. That might mean walking across fire-heated stones, or grasping a red-hot iron, or in some more creative villages, trying to stay underwater longer than your opponent while chanting insults. Yes, underwater trash talk, because Iceland is nothing if not poetic. And damp. Thankfully, most preferred mediation. Often, respected elders would step in, listen patiently, and deliver a compromise that everyone could sort of hate equally, which is the hallmark of a really good compromise. Now, our open historical debate. Was outlawry a death sentence or a second chance? Some historians argue it was essentially a form of social death, cut off from support, protection, and resources. Most outlaws didn't survive. Others suggest that many lived quite well, becoming respected hermits, mercenaries, or professional saga subjects. They fished, hunted, and occasionally returned years later for a dramatic redemption arc. The truth? Oh, likely both. Some vanished into the fjords, others became legends, and Iceland loved legends, especially the morally complicated kind. You wander into the food row, tempted by the smell of skyr, a thick, tangy dairy delight that feels like yogurt but tastes like Viking pride. You barter for a bowl, using a carved puffin token and a compliment about the vendor's eyebrows. It works. You sit on a stone, eating, listening to a passing debate about whether sheep can be emotional witnesses. The consensus, no, but only because they can't rhyme. The sun hangs low now, casting long golden lines across the plain. It won't set for hours, but it's clearly in no hurry to shine. You make your way toward the memory tent, where elders record the most memorable cases of the season. But there are no scrolls here, no books, only oral historians, sitting in circles, murmuring details over and over until they settle in like lava cooling into rock. His name was Bjarni. He claimed the fish were his. He offered 1 silver coin and a song. It was accepted. The memory is stored, safe. You pause by the lake, its surface still and glowing like polished obsidian. In the distance, a group of children play court, one pretending to be law speaker, the others arguing about imaginary goats. You smile. Even here, in a land of ash and ice, order must be taught early. And ideally, with snacks, you return to your tent. Your body aches in that good, honest way, like you've spent the day learning something old, important, and slightly absurd. Because the Althing isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a reminder that justice doesn't always need a courtroom, that law doesn't need robes, that fairness, real fairness, comes from community, memory, and just enough sarcasm to stay awake. You wake to rain, not a hard, vengeful downpour, but the soft kind that sounds like someone politely tapping on a tent with wet mittens. The kind of rain that turns moss into sponge, scrolls into mush, and legal proceedings into deeply soggy affairs. Still, the Althing does not stop, because Icelandic law waits for no drizzle. You emerge into a world of umbrellas that aren't really umbrellas, people holding sheep hides, tent flaps, or wide shields over their heads like awkward hats. Someone has fashioned a sort of judicial poncho out of seal leather. It smells like commitment and low tide. You follow a path toward the assembly glade where a particularly thorny inheritance dispute is about to begin. This one, it's generational. One man's father claimed land that was once swamp, then became usable, then flooded again, and now, somehow, is valuable enough for 4 cousins to yell over. The issue? There's no written deed, only a cairn of stones and a vague memory of a song that supposedly proves ownership. So yes, someone plans to sing in court. You pick a spot in the crowd and prepare for what will surely be a very awkward duet. Here comes your next historical truth. Property rights in medieval Iceland relied heavily on oral memory. There were no government archives, no notarized documents, just spoken claims, community recall, and witnesses who didn't fall asleep during the original agreement. A man might say, I was there when Einar marked the western ridge with his axe, and if enough people agreed, that was law. If they didn't, you might find your cabbage patch legally transformed into disputed territory. The inheritance trial begins. First, a cousin recites the boundary song, which goes, From basalt tooth to birch's crown, my grandfather walked the mossy ground. He staked his claim where rivers bend, and planted oats where streams descend. You're impressed? Rhyming under pressure is hard, especially when the outcome involves livestock redistribution. The judges listen, then nod gravely. A second cousin rises to challenge the melody. That's not the song I learned, he shouts. His oats were west, by the lava split. The first cousin turns red. People begin humming competing versions. Someone in the back asks, Can we just measure the land? A child replies, Then what would we argue about? Touché. Let's talk unusual legal penalties. Aside from fines and outlawry, medieval Icelanders sometimes imposed symbolic punishments. One saga mentions a man who was sentenced to apologize publicly, present a goat to the offended party, and spend 3 days reciting praise poetry to the goat. Why? To teach humility, also possibly to embarrass him into better behavior. Another tale involves a thief who, unable to repay what he stole, was ordered to sleep outside for a winter, as long as the moon grows, said the ruling, while townsfolk took turns feeding him bits of salted cod. Humane, petty, deeply Icelandic. You take a break from the trial, still ongoing, now featuring interpretive dance from a third cousin, and wander to the edge of the lake. There you find an old woman carving runes into driftwood. What are you writing, you ask? Nothing. She keeps carving. Then why the runes? Sometimes I forget what I know. This helps me remember what I forgot. You nod, because that either makes no sense or all the sense, depending on how much skyr you've eaten. Now for your open scholarly debate. Did the all things system promote justice or only delay conflict? One camp believes that its structure, open debate, public decisions, peer witnesses, made it remarkably egalitarian for its time. Another camp argues that the absence of enforcement mechanisms meant justice was hit or miss, and the most persuasive speaker, not the most truthful, often won. Still others say that was the point, that in a land without armies, police, or central authority, talking things out, even poorly, was better than burning everything down. Which is ironic, because Iceland had no shortage of sagas about burning things down anyway. But hey, balance. You return to the trial just in time for the ruling. The land in question is to be shared, alternating grazing seasons. The original boundary song is accepted, but future disputes must be accompanied by written memory sticks, aka notched bones or marked stones. The cousins must co-host a feast within 2 days to prove harmony. Also, the goat is declared neutral territory. You're unclear what that means legally, but the goat seems pleased. By evening, the Althing transitions again. Tents are lit by firelight. Songs drift across the plain. A bard strums a langspiel and sings a tale where the hero wins a lawsuit by proving he's never been angry, not even once. The crowd laughs. You sit beside a woman sharpening fish hooks. She says, "Tomorrow is duels." You blink. Legal duels? She shrugs. Legal-ish? Apparently, if both parties agree, they may settle their case with a contest, usually verbal, but sometimes involving staves, riddles, or endurance. Whoever wins, wins. Primitive? Maybe. But it's consensual, and it ends faster than appeals court. As night settles in and your thoughts grow misty, you think of what this place really is. Not a court, not a parliament, not even just a market. It's a rehearsal for fairness, for memory, for coexistence among people who mostly want to be left alone, except when someone moves their boundary stone by 2 goats' length, which, to be fair, is pretty offensive. By the time the final morning of the Althing arrives, the sky feels like it has sighed itself into stillness. No rain, no wind, just a chill in the air that smells faintly of campfire and fermented herring. You step outside your tent and stretch. Your spine cracks in 3 places. Someone nearby applauds. You're unsure if it's sincere or sarcastic, but you take the bow anyway. Today is settlement day, the last chance for old feuds to be resolved, debts repaid, or, if all else fails, encoded into saga verse for later generations to argue about. You make your way toward the law speaker's stone, where a new case is already underway. This one, a divorce. And unlike in other medieval societies, this is not scandalous. It's just procedural, with a little sass. Your next historical insight is this: Icelandic women in the medieval period had the legal right to initiate divorce. No trial necessary, just a formal statement, witnessed and repeated, declaring the marriage over. The most common phrasing was something like, I break this marriage as the gods break the sea from the shore. Elegant, poetic, and occasionally shouted over sheep. If property was involved, a judge would help split it. If children were involved, both families negotiated custody like barter-savvy diplomats. It wasn't perfect, but for the year 1000, surprisingly progressive. Back at the law speaker's stone, the couple stands facing each other. She, a fish merchant with arms like oars. He, a saga poet who once compared her cooking to boiled ambition. It's unclear who started the argument, but both seem ready to end it. She declares, I take back my cloak, my comb, and my cousin's goat. He replies, and I take back my respect, my rope, and the song I wrote about your stew. There's a long pause. Then a judge clears his throat and says, very well, you are now unbound. Next case? No screaming, no fire, just quiet dignity and a small group of onlookers who immediately begin adapting it into an emotional ballad. You wander back through the Althing for one final walk. The fields are already thinning out, tents are being packed, boats are being loaded, and the fog is slowly folding itself into the valleys like it knows the show is over. But one thing still draws a crowd: the final grievance wall. Here, participants post grievances they couldn't solve, etched into bone, scratched onto bark, or sung aloud to scribes with remarkable patience. Each begins with the phrase, let it be remembered, and then flows into tales of lost sheep, stolen lovers, unpaid debts, and the eternal mystery of who took Thorlak's best spoon. That last one is a local legend. Let's squeeze in our final scholarly debate of the act. Was the Althing meant to create lasting justice, or just maintain short-term peace? Historians remain divided. One camp sees it as a brilliant experiment in shared governance, a system built from necessity but filled with community wisdom and surprisingly fair rules. Others argue it was patchwork politics, barely holding things together with clever speeches and the occasional duel. But most agree. For a society without kings, jails, or standing armies, the Althing worked far better than it had any right to. And maybe, just maybe, that's the point. The sun tilts low now, just enough to cast everything in gold. You pass a group of young kids reenacting the goat insult case from earlier. One of them wears a tunic too big, The other holds a broom like a law speaker's staff. You pause and smile because what you've witnessed over these nights and days wasn't just law, it was culture, identity, memory passed forward from ridge to rock, from voice to verse, from one stubborn storytelling people to the next. As the last fires go out and the last sheep are rounded up, you return to your tent and sit quietly. No laws to recite, no disputes to solve, just the distant laughter of departing travelers and the promise of next year's Althing, because it always comes back. And so do the people, with new stories, new arguments, new goats, and hopefully fewer stolen spoons. You don't expect to feel nostalgic for a bunch of tents and grumpy sheep, but as the days pass and the all thing fades into memory, you realize something's missing. The people, the voices, the rhythm. It's quiet now, not the peaceful kind of quiet, the echoing kind. You're back in your home valley, where waterfalls thread through black stone like silk, and the only arguments are between wind and window shutters. But still, your thoughts drift. You find yourself quoting rulings to your goats. They remain unimpressed. You try to settle a chicken dispute using poetry. It goes badly. So when the traveling law speaker arrives, asking for help collecting stories from the last Althing, you say yes before he finishes his sentence. You pack dried fish, extra ink, and a tunic that smells vaguely of moss and hope. Now begins your journey through memory. You're not just remembering the Althing, you're preserving it, not the facts, but the feeling, not the rulings, but the people who shaped them. You travel from farm to fjord, visiting those who were there. Not all are eager to talk. Some claim their memories are too fresh. Others say, talk to the goat. He remembers everything. But slowly, gently, the stories come loose. Your first stop, the cousin duel from the inheritance dispute. You find one of them stacking firewood, now missing an eyebrow, not related to the case, apparently. He says, I still think my verse was better, but sharing the land's fine. We built a shared fence. It's crooked, but fair. He pauses, then adds, and that goat? She's pregnant. We're arguing over the name. You write that down carefully because memory, like goats, multiplies when you least expect it. Let's ground ourselves in our first historical truth of Act 3. The Althing was as much social festival as legal gathering. Yes, laws were passed. Yes, verdicts were issued. But also, people met future spouses, formed trade deals, shared songs, gossip, and experimental fish pies. It was like a cross between a courtroom, a farmer's market, and a family reunion, if the family was prone to passive aggressive rhyming and knew how to knit armor. You next visit the divorcees. They now live 2 valleys apart. She runs a fish stall near the coast. He composes saga verses for wedding feasts, mostly about other people's divorces. You ask how they're doing. She says, better. I don't miss his snoring. I do miss his stew. He says, she's doing well. She always did know how to win an argument. Neither speaks badly of the other. You realize the all thing didn't just separate them, it preserved their dignity. You record their words with care. Now for your odd detail of the day. Some Icelandic settlements used moss color to determine grazing rights. Yes, moss. Bright green moss meant fertile ground. Yellowed moss suggested overuse or harsh winters. If two neighbors argued about pasture land, elders might literally sniff the moss, examine its texture, and then declare, "This land is weary, let it rest." Moss, it turns out, is the Icelandic version of satellite imagery, just squishier. As you travel, stories pile up like snowdrifts. A man tells you about the woman who settled a boundary dispute by making both families adopt her cow, forcing them to cooperate on milking schedules. A boy remembers a case where someone claimed his neighbor's ghosts were stealing soup. No one believed him, but they made the neighbor move anyway, just in case. You document it all. Our next academic debate arrives quietly. Were medieval Icelanders truly law abiding or just drama resistant? Some scholars claim their high rate of court attendance shows deep respect for justice. Others suggest they simply liked storytelling, and the courtroom was just another stage. When you hear someone say, "I went to the Althing to sue my brother, but mostly to hear that saga about the haunted pig," you start to suspect it's a bit of both, and maybe that's enough. Back at your own farm, you sit by the fire and review your notes. Dozens of voices, hundreds of moments, not a single parchment scroll in sight, all memory, all floating in your head. And you realize you are now a living archive, a walking scroll, a keeper of quiet things, a chronicler of justice that came dressed in wool and sarcasm. A week later, you arrive at the cliffs above Thingvellir, the site of the Althing, now empty, silent, and softened by moss and memory. The grass has rebounded where tents once pressed it down. Birdsong echoes in places where court arguments once rang out. And yet, as you walk, you hear it all. Laughter around fire pits, debates over sheep lineage, the unmistakable crack of someone slipping on wet stone mid speech and insisting it was part of their argument. You sit on the law speaker's rock and whisper the rulings you've gathered, not to anyone in particular, but to the space itself, and it listens. Because this land remembers. Your historical anchor for today. The Althing was held in the same spot from its founding in 930 AD until 1798. That's nearly 900 years. In all that time, no permanent structure was ever built, because the Althing wasn't a place. It was a moment, a gathering, a rhythm of law and life, and that rhythm echoed generation after generation through valleys and volcanoes until it became as much a part of the landscape as lava rock and gulls. You decide to visit the forgotten corners of the legal system, the cases that didn't get sagas, the rulings no one sings about, the moments where justice came in sideways, like mist through cracks in stone. One woman tells you about a judgment where a man was ordered to carry water daily for a widow because his pigs broke her well. Another recalls a case where a boy was sentenced to recite 10 compliments to his sister's suitor after publicly calling him a puffin with ambition. And then there's the man who accidentally married the wrong cousin due to a translation issue in the family tree. The ruling: stay married, but don't have children. He says they did anyway, and they're lovely. You learn about legal nicknames too, like Sheep Ear Finn, who once claimed to recognize stolen livestock by ear shape alone, or Half Oath Burgdus, who notoriously mumbled during sworn statements and became a cautionary tale for apprentice witnesses. Some of these people are legends, others are just oddities, but each left a mark on the collective ledger of Iceland, not on paper, but in remembered quirks, and in a society that treated memory like gold, that meant everything. Here's your quirky legal curiosity. Court speakers sometimes used silence as a tactic. If an opponent made an argument that was dangerously compelling, the best response wasn't always rebuttal. It was polite silence, followed by a very slow, very thoughtful drink of water. The audience would lean in, uncertain if it was strategy, surrender, or a stroke. And in the meantime, the pressure shifted. One saga even mentions a man who won a case by pretending to fall asleep mid-trial. His opponent grew so flustered trying to wake him that he contradicted his own argument. You can't teach that. You just have to be really, really tired. Now for a philosophical turn. As you walk the ridge where judges once stood, you wonder, was the all thing truly fair? It depended on who you were, how loud you spoke, who remembered your father's name. Some cases were settled with honor, others with grudges. But more than once you've heard the elders say, we didn't always get justice, but we got to speak and we were heard. And in a world without jails, swords, or kings, maybe being heard was the most powerful form of justice available. A farmer invites you into her home. She once served as a mediator years ago in a case involving stolen cheese and a jealous neighbor. Her ruling: the thief had to work in the dairy for 2 seasons, unpaid, and return all future cheese with an apology carved into the rind. When you ask if it worked, she shrugs. Sort of. He's lactose intolerant now, so poetic. She pours you skyr in a wooden bowl, topped with cold berries and a drizzle of honey. You think, justice should always taste like this. You return to your own home, your journal brimming with voices, some in verse, some in bitterness, some in joy so simple it sounds like music when read aloud. And you begin to organize them, not alphabetically, not by case type, but by tone, because the law of the all thing wasn't cold or clinical, it was warm and weird, and occasionally included goats. You sit by your fire that night and rehearse a story aloud. It's not dramatic. Just a small tale about 2 neighbors who disagreed over a fish drying rack. They brought it to court, argued with dignity, and left with a shared rack and a plan to take turns using it. You whisper their names to the dark, and for the first time in a long while, you feel them smile back.